Before we get into day 2 of the Lindsay Clancy trial, I want to make something very clear. This is not a video for or against Lindsay Clancy. If you are looking for a video that completely supports Lindsay, excuses every piece of evidence against her, and refuses to acknowledge anything damaging to the defense, this probably isn't the video for you. And if you are looking for a video that completely attacks Lindsay, assumes everything the prosecution says must automatically be true, and refuses to acknowledge weaknesses in the state's case, well, this probably isn't the video for you either. What we are going to do is call it as we see it. We are going to look at both sides with scrutiny. When the prosecution makes a strong point, we'll say so. When the defense makes a strong point, we'll say so. But when either side stretches something, overplays something, or tries to sell the jury a narrative that the evidence doesn't quite support, we're going to call that out too. Because day 2 gave us plenty to talk about. Patrick Clancy returned to the witness stand, and understandably, some of his testimony was absolutely heartbreaking. He described returning home after picking up food and medicine, finding the house unusually quiet, discovering blood in the bedroom and an open window, and then finding Lindsay outside. Patrick testified that Lindsay told him she had tried to kill herself and that the children were in the basement. What followed was Patrick describing finding his 3 children. This was undoubtedly one of the most difficult portions of day 2 to listen to. Whatever conclusions people ultimately reach about Lindsay's criminal responsibility, Patrick was a father describing the moment his entire world changed. His testimony was raw, devastating, and deeply personal. There are parts of a trial where the evidence needs to be scrutinized and challenged, but there are also moments where the human tragedy behind the legal arguments becomes impossible to ignore. This was one of those moments. But once we move away from those devastating moments, day 2 becomes very interesting legally, because the prosecution clearly wants the jury to see Lindsay as someone who was functioning, deliberate, and capable of planning. And honestly, they scored some points here. Angela Krause from CVS and Saria Sweeney-Shalgren from 3V Restaurant testified about brief telephone interactions with Lindsay that evening. The significance is obvious. These conversations happened very close to the killings, and Lindsay apparently didn't sound wildly confused, incoherent, or obviously detached from reality. That's useful evidence for the prosecution. If their argument is that Lindsay knew exactly what she was doing, evidence showing her functioning normally shortly beforehand absolutely matters. But let's be careful. Sounding normal during a short telephone conversation does not automatically prove someone isn't experiencing severe mental illness. That's where I think the prosecution has to avoid overselling this evidence. A person can order food correctly and still be seriously mentally ill. Ordering Mediterranean takeout isn't exactly a psychiatric evaluation. So yes, prosecution gets the point. But let's not award them the entire game. Then Kevin Reddington began cross-examining Patrick, and this is where things started getting uncomfortable for the prosecution. Because Patrick was their witness. Yet several of his answers appeared to help the defense. The prosecution had introduced this idea of Lindsay being controlling, meticulous, and extremely rigid about schedules involving the children. But Patrick didn't necessarily view those schedules negatively. From his perspective, some of those detailed instructions were helpful. And I think the prosecution needs to be careful here. Having 3 very young children on schedules doesn't automatically make somebody sinister or controlling. Parents schedule naps. Parents schedule meals. Parents write down instructions. And parents with 3 small children probably consider getting everyone fed, bathed, and asleep on schedule a minor miracle. That's parenting, not necessarily evidence of criminal intent. If the prosecution eventually connects Lindsay's need for control to stronger evidence showing planning or motive, then fine. But simply showing the jury detailed childcare schedules and expecting everyone to gasp isn't enough for me. Then we got into Lindsay's medications. This was one of the most interesting portions of Patrick's cross-examination. The prosecution had raised questions surrounding the pills remaining in certain medication bottles, potentially suggesting Lindsay wasn't taking medications as prescribed. That sounds damaging. Until context arrives. And context has an annoying habit of ruining a perfectly dramatic courtroom narrative. Patrick explained that some medications had been discontinued because prescriptions or dosages had changed. In other words, pills remaining in an old bottle don't necessarily mean Lindsay simply decided not to take her medication. Patrick essentially acknowledged that without the additional context, it could paint a different picture. That was a strong moment for Reddington. The defense also produced medication bottles from Lindsay's nightstand drawer, including empty bottles. And then came a detail that made me stop. An Apple Watch. According to Patrick's testimony, Lindsay's Apple Watch was still inside that drawer and apparently hadn't been seized by police. Now, I'm not saying that proves anything improper. Maybe investigators had reasons. Maybe other devices contained the information they needed. But considering how important digital timelines can become in a case like this, I think asking why an Apple Watch belonging to the accused wasn't initially seized is completely fair. Police collected mountains of evidence, but apparently the watch was sitting there like, "Don't mind me, I'm just a digital device capable of recording activity." That deserves scrutiny. Another important part of Reddington's cross was his attempt to establish Lindsay's relationship with the children before January 24. Patrick repeatedly described her as a loving, dedicated mother. He talked about her reading to them, taking care of them, documenting their lives, and displaying their artwork. Reddington even asked whether Lindsay resented Dawson. Patrick said no. This obviously helps the defense because they're trying to argue that what happened represented a catastrophic mental collapse rather than Lindsay secretly harboring hatred toward her children. But here's where I'm going to be equally critical of the defense. Being a loving mother before committing an unthinkable act doesn't automatically establish insanity at the moment of the act. Photographs of happy family vacations are emotionally powerful. They're relevant to understanding who Lindsay was. But smiling photographs don't diagnose postpartum psychosis either. The defense still has to prove its actual legal argument. And the prosecution is entitled to say that people who commit terrible crimes can have loving relationships beforehand. Reddington also established that there had been other occasions when Lindsay was alone with the children, including when Patrick traveled for work. That's interesting because it potentially challenges the idea that Lindsay had been patiently waiting for an opportunity to kill them. If she had opportunities before January 24, why didn't she act then? That's a legitimate defense point. But it's not the knockout punch some might think it is. People can form intentions at different times. The fact that Lindsay didn't harm her children previously doesn't prove she couldn't have planned to do so later. So again, point to the defense, but we're keeping the champagne in the refrigerator. Another major issue hovering over day 2 involved the defense challenging how certain evidence had been characterized. Reddington objected to references suggesting Lindsay had searched for ways to kill, arguing that the underlying context involved suicide-related searches. If that's accurate, that's not a tiny semantic disagreement. There is an enormous difference between searching for ways to kill yourself and searching for ways to kill somebody else. If the prosecution's wording creates an impression that isn't supported by the actual search history, the defense is absolutely right to challenge it. And quite frankly, if you're prosecuting a murder case, you shouldn't need creative wording to make your evidence sound worse than it actually is. Let the evidence be damaging because it's damaging, not because you found the most dramatic way of describing it. But the defense doesn't get a free pass either. If Lindsay's digital activity ultimately shows planning, timing, research, or behavior consistent with the prosecution's theory, Reddington can't simply explain every uncomfortable piece of evidence away by shouting context. Sometimes context helps. Sometimes context hurts. The jury deserves all of it. There were also numerous sidebars and lengthy breaks throughout day 2. At times it felt like the sidebar deserved its own witness chair. But we need to be responsible here. Unless we know exactly what was discussed outside the jury's hearing, we shouldn't invent courtroom drama and claim the judge was reprimanding someone. There was clearly legal wrangling happening, but disagreement between lawyers is not unusual in a murder trial. And Kevin Reddington is certainly not a defense attorney who appears terrified of confrontation. But neither should prosecutors be offended when their evidence is aggressively challenged. That's literally his job. So where does day 2 leave us? For me, neither side walked away untouched. The prosecution presented compelling evidence that Lindsay could communicate normally shortly before the killings and presented Patrick's devastating account of what happened that evening. Those are strong points. But Patrick also complicated parts of the prosecution's narrative. He didn't necessarily see Lindsay's routines as controlling. He provided context surrounding discontinued medications. He described Lindsay as a loving and devoted mother. And the defense raised legitimate questions about how some evidence was being characterized and what investigators did or didn't collect. At the same time, the defense needs to be careful not to turn every weakness in the investigation into proof of psychosis. An Apple Watch not being seized doesn't establish insanity. A loving family photograph doesn't establish insanity. A discontinued prescription doesn't establish insanity. Eventually, Reddington has to connect those pieces to the actual legal question facing the jury. And the prosecution has its own problem. Being organized isn't proof of murder. Having schedules isn't proof of murder. Sounding normal while ordering dinner isn't proof that someone wasn't mentally ill. Eventually, prosecutors also have to connect their pieces to criminal responsibility. That's why day 2 was so fascinating. Both sides were beginning to build very different versions of the same woman. The prosecution wants the jury to see planning, control, and awareness. The defense wants the jury to see a devoted mother whose mental health deteriorated despite repeatedly seeking treatment. And I don't think either side should get away with asking the jury to simply accept their version without proving it. If the prosecution says this was calculated, show us the evidence of calculation. If the defense says this was psychosis, show us the evidence of psychosis. Don't give us labels. Don't give us dramatic adjectives. Give us evidence. Because ultimately, the truth isn't determined by which attorney tells the better story. It's determined by what the evidence can actually support. And now we would love to hear from you all. First, after watching Patrick Clancy's testimony, do you think he ultimately helped the prosecution more, or did his answers actually give the defense more than prosecutors expected? Second, what did you make of the medication testimony? Do you think the prosecution placed too much emphasis on pills remaining in certain bottles without enough context about prescriptions being discontinued? And third, what do you think about Lindsay's Apple Watch apparently not being seized? Is that a significant investigative oversight, or do you think the defense is making something bigger out of something that ultimately doesn't matter? Let us know what you think in the comments, but please remember that people are going to have very different opinions about this case. We can disagree without attacking one another. And this brings us to the end of today's video. Thanks for watching, take care and stay safe.